Thank you. Yes, perfect. So I will share a little bit about, oh, this is loud. I'll have to tone down a little bit. I don't want to scream the whole day. I'll share a little bit about my experience around transformations. And yesterday, I felt a bit called out in the morning when someone asked who works with COBOL. So I should probably start with saying that I work with a lot of legacy technologies. So if you're expecting a serverless talk, this is not going to be one of those. I work in a lot of really large organizations, and I've been doing this kind of work for about, I don't know, 15 years or so. And when I started working with all the automation, deployment automation, etc., I would have thought that by now we are done. I mean, quite seriously, by now all of this stuff should be automated, you shouldn't have problems, and yet I keep walking into organizations where source code is on a USB drive that gets handed over, where files get emailed to someone to deploy into production. And I know this doesn't happen in any of your organizations, but it happens in the ones that I've seen. And I'm surprised. Like, why is that the case? And I spent a lot of time thinking about that, and I will share a little bit of what I've learned with you over the next 45 minutes. All right, so what does this talk about? So a little bit about my own story. So I was an engineer. I started my career there back when waterfall was still the thing to do. You kind of learned exactly how to do projects. As a developer, that very often meant you got a detailed technical design that you had the pleasure of translating into code. Wasn't as much programming as I was hoping for. But the method was given, and with the method, some level of success was achieved. Then I fell into Agile and said, well, perfect. If we just have a better method, right? If waterfall doesn't work, but perhaps if we have a better method like Agile, then that will solve the problem. We just all have to follow it, right? Well, that didn't really work terribly well, because we ended up still having to do lots of manual testing, manual deployments, and if you try to do that in a 2-week sprint, you're obviously not going to be very successful. So I said, okay, fine. Then it must be DevOps, right? It must be the tooling, the automation, and once you have given the engineers the right tools, the right method, then it will work, right? And still it doesn't, right? So now I'm in this phase where I'm looking at everything that belongs into it, right? So the culture, the process, the tools, and try to figure out, why is it not working? Like, why is it so hard, this transformation? I will highlight a couple of, I'll go into 5 different things to talk about. So one is the goals, right? Are we even aiming for the right things? Are we even understand what we are aiming for? I'm talking about DOGMA. So is it this or that? Is it the specific method? Is it the specific tool? The technologies that we are working with, as I said, I work with COBOL, I work with SAP, I work with Siebel. We talk about Kubernetes, you can talk about Jenkins. Do we even have the right tools? Obviously, I will talk about culture, and I will talk about what I call over-optimism. And I'll explain that. But as engineers, and I get the feeling that there's lots and lots of engineers in the room, we have a real problem thinking about problems in a very optimistic way. And we think technology will solve it for us. Okay, so why am I the right person to talk about this? As I said, my name is Mirco. I'm the global DevOps lead for Accenture. So that means I have the pleasure of dealing with lots of large clients. Really follows in 3 categories the kind of work that I'm doing. One is doing consulting with those big clients that are going through this transformation, but I'm also doing solutioning for really large projects, which means I get to really solve how we do them. The thing where I learn the most is the third task that I have, and that is when something goes really, really badly, I get asked to come in and see whether I can help. So I see all these things where on paper it looked good, but then didn't turn out so well. And obviously from those things you learn more. So if you ask me what credentials I have to stand in front of you, it's probably the best thing I can say is I've seen more failures than others. I can't say that I've been more successful than others, but I've seen more failure and I've learned from them. I blog on Not a Factory anymore, and 2 years ago I wrote a book about enterprise transformation, which is available pretty much everywhere. Cool, so let's go into this. So, as I said, this is an article I wrote a couple of years ago, and that was really the start of this journey that led into this talk. right? So why are we still fighting the same problems that we fight 15 years ago? So 15 years ago, when I started working in kind of corporate IT, we had Control M doing deployments automatically. We had some level of test automation for which we had written scripts. It was all COBOL, so don't get me wrong, it's still not, it wasn't the fanciest technology. And I came from uni and I studied artificial intelligence and did a lot of that programming in Java. And then I go into corporate life and the first job is COBOL. You can imagine how amazed I was. And like, yes, COBOL. But still, like, there's still a lot of COBOL being written. I still have projects with COBOL. So if you want to have a future-proof career, COBOL is good because most of those people are retiring, and there's people who now need to maintain that. So if you look for a new career, COBOL is not a bad one. But so all that automation was there already 15 years ago. We didn't have Jenkins. We didn't have Selenium or any of that kind of stuff. But we had a good level of automation. And then you kind of keep doing your project, and you just assume that everyone is working like that. So I had the pleasure of going through 2 or 3 long-term projects where we had a decent level of automation. And then I came out of that into the wild, wild world and realized that it's not everywhere like that. And I was like, well, what happened? Right? If we had so much automation in many places, why have we fallen back? And here see, and I mean, you can read the article, but in short, we had a period of time where easy answers were available. Right? And so if you're an IT department and you're trying to look for optimization, cost reduction, etc., then there was a time where you could just say, well, the vendor will do it. Right? If I just take a big package software, they will take care of everything. So I don't have to worry about the engineering. Right? We just buy it, it will run, they will provide all the tools, I don't have to worry about it. There was also a chance of just moving work from one location to another and make it cheaper through that, just through the salary difference. And so there were easy answers that didn't require us to do engineering. So we didn't do engineering. And now we realize that that didn't go terribly well, and we're now trying to bring this kind of engineering practice back. Yeah, and I think that's where Agile and certainly DevOps has taken the mind of the market, because we now realize that we need to do something different. We need to go back to some of these engineering capabilities. But to me, it's still surprising that 15 years later, we're still talking about this. So as all these organizations are going through transformations, here's kind of how that looks like. And things have really changed, right? So this is a very typical model that we've seen in the past. There was a business problem. Yeah, the business wasn't terribly happy with IT. So we start a big transformation or a big project, an ERP implementation, a CRM implementation, whatever, with the goal of achieving this thing up here, right? It's called the end state. Has anyone here been creating an end state architecture? No? A few? I've done a few in my career. And you know what has anyone ever been there at this end state? No, right? The annoying thing about the end state is it keeps moving. But all the projects in the past were kind of created with this. Once we've implemented the ERP system, then everything is fine. Now we don't have to worry about it anymore. Right? We just need to maintain it, and things go well. Reality is, when we get to this kind of top of the mountain, the end state that we've set ourselves, we realize that there's still a lot more to go. But reality is we've just spent all that money. Right? We spent $200 million on a new ERP system. You know what we do next? We need to save a little bit. Right? We cut some corners, we reduce the team size, and technical debt increases. Right? And so technical debt increases until the point that you can't maintain it. Then someone wakes up and says, shit, we really need to do something about this, and we start the next transformation. Right? And this cycle goes 5 years. In between this, you might have a CIO change. The new CIO plays golf with a different tech vendor, so we implement a new technology. Someone makes a trip to the Silicon Valley. They found a new cool technology and said, now everything needs to be Docker or whatever, right? That looks ridiculous, right? It's a really good model for companies to provide services, because whenever you get down here, you can come in and say, guess what, I can help you. And then you come back 5 years later again, and you can do it again and again. It's a beautiful model. And I say that fully appreciating that I work for a consulting company. So, but the thing is, this worked and it was okay, right? Because these 5-year cycles were completely appropriate. There was no technology that was that much faster. Right? So you could actually afford that. If you did an ERP implementation in the late 80s or early 90s, 5 years was okay. Yeah? The problem is, Now it's not okay anymore, and we still treat it like that. We treat Agile and DevOps transformations like this, where we say, well, we just need to be here. We just need to be like Netflix or Spotify or whatever. And the answer is obviously that we can't do it that way, right? We can't do this kind of as-is-to-be comparison and just hope it will work. So what we really need to do is this, and we need to become a learning and ever-improving organization. Now, I work in consulting, as I said, right? So people always ask me, what is my job in this? And the best analogy that I have for that is that of a medical doctor. Now, imagine you're a medical doctor, and this person comes in, middle-aged, white male, overweight, has high blood pressure. He comes to you and says, I really need to do something. I have to get quickly out of breath, have high blood pressure. What do you think that person wants from you as a doctor? They want the pill, right? Just the thing that they need to take in the morning. Or perhaps they're willing to do a 3-month cabbage diet. And your job as a doctor is to say, sorry, mate, that's not how it works, right? You need to work out more, eat better, and it's not going to be something that you're going to do for 6 weeks, and you can do that for the rest of your life. Yeah, that's kind of the job of a consultant in this transformation. Right? And additionally to that is, you can't do that for that person. You can only be there on the sidelines helping them. Yeah, so it's a very different and a very tricky conversation because you can't actually outsource this transformation. You can't hand this over to someone else. You have to do it yourself in your own organization. You can get help, like that man who came into your medical practice, but you still have to do it yourself. All right, so that is a tricky conversation. And that is not just a tricky conversation for us, it's a tricky conversation if you want to do it in your own organization. Because when you go to your sponsors and you say, I need some money to do this, they say, okay, how much and when are you done? And the answer is, well, probably never, and I can't really tell you how much I need. But give me something and we can get started. Yeah, so that's very counterintuitive to what we used to do. Okay, so if you have this now in mind as a kind of mental model that we're going to go through, so let's go into the different areas that I want to dive into. The first one is goals, right? And goals are something really tricky. Because if you look at your organization, and this is just assume that these are all different teams and their different maturities, what is the right goal to set? And I've worked with a bunch of organizations that create engineering standards. Right? And that's a good thing. Engineering standards are to be standards. But how do you set standards? Right? You can set them somewhere down here where you say, okay, I don't want to offend anyone. These are standards. They're meant to be, everyone needs to be able to achieve them. Well, it's not terribly engaging. You can do that, but it won't necessarily change your organization. Right? You can set something in the middle, right? And that is, the people who have not done any automation will start feeling a bit of pressure and shit, perhaps we should look into this. But then a lot of people are above that. Or do you set it above the line and say, it's an ambition. But if it's an ambition, can it be a standard? Or are you going to now spend more time talking about exceptions than you're actually going to talk about doing that? When you say 80% test automation, is it feasible for SAP or COBOL or Salesforce or whatever? Right? When you say everything needs to be directly provisioned in the cloud, is it something that's feasible? Or are you now creating a process where lots of people have to create exceptions? Yeah, and then of course you can get all the way up there and say, it's really outrageous, everything needs to be serverless. And that is not unlike when that person comes into your medical practice, to stay with that example, right? That person comes in and says, hey, I saw a video of Usain Bolt, right? And here's these kind of exercise videos. I think that's what I want to do from tomorrow, right? And, as a doctor, your advice would be like, whoa, dude, that's not the right thing to go. Right? This is dangerous for you. But that is the equivalent of an existing large legacy organization where the CIO comes back and says, hey, I spoke to Google. I want to be Google, right? It's exactly the same. The organization is just not ready for that yet. Yeah? So it's really dangerous because if you set it too low, nothing will change. If you set it too high, people will just ignore it, right? Or they will just do the necessary and nod and then move on and say, well, we're never going to get there anyway. Yeah? So setting goals is not easy. There's also, you need to understand what you can actually achieve. Right? So this is coming from production systems. In IT, we take a lot of thoughts from manufacturing. And this is one where that makes sense. In manufacturing, if you produce two goods, let's say you produce Pepsi and Coke and Fanta. Then you need to determine how much Coke do I need to produce before I switch to Fanta, if I use the same machines, so that I can basically sell both of them to the market. If I create too little Coke and start producing Fanta, then we're going to run out of that Coke. If I produce too much Coke, then I will have lots and lots of stock until I start producing Fanta. That's the idea. In IT, it's not dissimilar. Holding cost is ultimately all the cost, the opportunity cost of functionality that you've written that is not in production yet. Right? The transaction cost is how much will it cost me to actually bring it live. Now, if you have these two functions, then you can say, okay, because it takes me forever to put something into production because of all the testing and deployment process, then you're going to have a pretty large batch. Right? So you have lots of stuff that you've already created that you haven't put live yet, but you have to have a large batch size. When the transaction cost goes down, our batch size can become smaller efficiently. Yeah? And that is exactly what has happened. That's where DevOps has come from. Because here, in the old days, and I still did projects that way, you had to order service. They came on a truck. They were driven to a data center where someone put them in there, put cables in there. That transaction cost is significant. So you can't do monthly releases of that because that's a hell of a lot of trucks driving around. Yeah? Now, with the cloud and all the automation, that transaction cost has come down. So we can reduce the batch size. We can do weekly, daily, hourly releases as we like. The flip side to that is when we have an old process, like old governance, old transaction costs where we do a lot of manual testing, we can't just reduce the batch size. You can't just introduce Agile and hope magically that will work. It becomes very, very expensive. Yeah, and lots of organizations have gone through that. They introduced Agile, then realized that it's really expensive when you do manual regression testing in every sprint, when you still go through a deployment process that takes you 3 months. And the answer to that is that we need to think about this transaction cost first before we reduce the batch size, at least if we want to be efficient. Let me get to DOGMA. Now some people realize what this is, but I'm probably aging myself. This is Monty Python. Is anyone here knows Monty Python? Oh yes, a few. Thank God. So this is the best representation that I have of what's going on in the Agile industry at the moment, right? Because there is Scrum Alliance and Scrum.org and Agile Alliance and SAFe and yada, 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 yada. And in DevOps, we're not unlike that. There's, you can either be in camp A or camp B, the Jenkins camp or the non-Jenkins camp, the DevOps team camp or the non-DevOps team camp. And the reality behind this is exactly like here, right? We are not the Judean People's Front. We are the People's Front of Judea. It's all the same thing, right? We are here to build better solutions faster. And all the energy that is being spent for that's not the real DevOps or that's not the real Agile or whatever is utter waste of time. Yeah, and it goes as far, and I can't remember where I heard that, but there are now Agile certifications that if you are a trainer of X, you cannot be certified in another Agile method. I mean, how much nonsense is that? Yeah, we've created a world where this is more religious than it's actually helpful, right? So we need to really look beyond that dogma. And so whenever I go in somewhere and someone, but Mirco, you can't do that, that's not DevOps. I'm like, well, who holds that truth? Like, who is the person that holds what is DevOps and what isn't? Yeah. So we really need to start focusing a lot more on what is the problem that we are trying to solve and not what tool or method or whatever we've subscribed to. And it's quite funny that, like, it's quite literally that the Agile guys are the least Agile. Like, I'll tell you a story. I was at a client, and we had a nice Agile setup, and a new Agile coach comes in, and he's like, well, Mirco, there's a few things we need to change here because they're not working well. I'm like, okay, well, take that. Like, what? He's like, well, you can't call that user story. That's a PBI. I'm like, what? Sorry, what are you talking about? He's like, well, that's a PBI in Scrum. It's called product backlog item, not user story. So we need to change that. I'm like, okay, and who will that help? And he's like, well, that's what the method says. Yeah. And it went on, and then the next thing he was like, well, you can't call it a daily stand-up. It's a daily Scrum. And actually, it's pretty offensive to call it a daily stand-up. What for all these people who can't stand up? So it's like, that's the kind of energy that I really don't want to spend. I don't want to work with those kind of people. I want to solve problems and not the purity of the method. And then, we have this whole thing about DevOps teams. And DevOps teams are being used now in so many different ways. There's actually a book that just came out, Team Topologies, which I highly recommend because they kind of go into this process a little bit. But there's so many organizations where, okay, we have an Agile team, we have an operations team, we put the ops guy into the dev team, hallelujah, we are DevOps. Right? DevOps just solve things. I mean, how hard can this be? They're sitting together, that's all we needed to do. If you look at a large organization, what an ops team is, right? An ops team is something like this. A DBA, there's help desk, there's mainframe, networks, batches, da-da-da-da-da-da. So what we are really saying is, take your 8 people, the Agile team, and just put one of each of these in there. Right? So you have a team of like 20. That's insane. Like, whoever came up with that idea has never worked in a large organization. Yeah? And the answer to that is obviously we need to find a way that the team feels fully accountable for what they are doing, and that they have access to the right skills and the right capabilities, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we have all the skills in their team. That works in small organizations, small teams. In large organizations, it just doesn't work. Yeah? And it doesn't help when then people come in as a DevOps coach and say like, well, you can't have another team. Like, it needs to be always in that one team. I'll give you another example of a client I'm working with. Right? They want to make this move, and they, okay, fine, we can do that, but we really don't want to see an operations team. Right? Everything needs to be covered within that one team. I'm like, okay, cool, that sounds reasonable. It's like, how many tickets do you get? Oh, about 10,000 a month. I'm like, so now you're saying we're going to pump 10,000 tickets into this team and hope that they perhaps deliver some code as well. Well, it's not going to happen. Right? You're so immature at this point that you first need to clean that mess up before you can really get to this kind of DevOps world. Yeah, so, and this is, again, something where we are hurting ourselves by making the perfect the enemy of the better. Right? Because we should improve first before we start saying, well, until it's perfect, I'm not going to do anything. Yeah, we're just using an excuse. So here's kind of the way that I often see that develop. Right? So you have these Agile teams, and there might be a superstructure, like a safe release train or anything like that. We will put some governance on top, and I really mean the minimum viable governance. You might have an Agile coach, you might have a technical architect, those kind of things. Not layers and layers of management, but really just people who kind of look across the teams. And then underneath that is what I call the platform. Yeah, and the platform is what abstracts these teams away from all the unnecessary operations work. And that might sound ridiculous that you have a DevOps team, but think about it differently, right? If we're using a cloud, you would not argue that you want to create your own AWS cloud, right? You say, it's fine, use AWS, right? Now, if you say it's okay to use AWS because you don't need to have an AWS person in your team, then that's not different to your own infrastructure services in your organization, as long as they provide it as self-service capabilities, right? And if you're working with a cloud service, you might use their DevOps services, right? You might use Azure DevOps or an AWS DevOps service. And again, you're not saying that the people who have created that need to be in your team. So you can have exactly the same for your organization. And now all we're saying is that is your platform team. And that platform team provides all those capabilities that these teams here can operate autonomously. But that's all we are saying. Right? And all the argument that you shouldn't have an extra team outside of the Agile teams is just nonsense, because all these people exist. And look, when this is really efficient, you don't need people to look after that. You can condense them into the Agile team, run them as a squad or whatever, and that's fine. Yeah, but just don't make it sound too hard. And if you look at, this is from last year's State of DevOps report from Puppet, they actually described a very similar journey of maturity as well, where it goes through the normalization of the technology stack, you standardize it, and then at the end you have these provide self-service capabilities, which is exactly that state that I've described here. Yeah, so it's actually a relatively common pattern that you can follow. There's another thing that I have a personal love-hate relationship with, and that is maturity models. Anyone here has used a maturity model? Yeah, a few people. See, maturity models are useful when they're used by the team, but they're not terribly useful when someone uses them to assess someone. Yeah, and I really have a problem with it. We had no, I read it this morning. I don't think it was on a slide. People here heard about Dunning-Kruger? A few people. So the Dunning-Kruger effect is ultimately people who don't know a lot about a topic believe they understand it relatively well. And the more you know, the more you realize there's so much I don't know, right? Which leads to people make very inaccurate assessments. So if you look at some surveys, there's, I will take the one that probably resonates best. There was a research done in a management magazine where they asked all the managers who here believes it's in the top 10% of management, and about 83% said yes, they are. Now, that doesn't work terribly well, right? That is what the Dunning-Kruger effect is. People who don't know terribly well about a topic believe they're pretty good at it. That's what happened with maturity models. You will see that teams that are really, really good at something will be really hard critics on themselves. Right? They're saying, well, we are not using continuous integration because we don't have full code coverage and da-da-da-da-da yet. While other people who've just installed Jenkins and had the first automated job run would say, oh, we're using continuous integration. Yeah, and maturity models are exactly that, right? They lead you into this conversation where you're answering the question the way you intend to answer this, rather than what the real maturity is. I was part of CMMI reviews many years ago, and the question they ask is like, do you do risk management? Right? Well, yes, of course. Like, do you have a risk management system? Yes. And that's where the question stopped. And I knew that this risk management system that we had on some SharePoint, no one had looked at for years. Right? But that's not what mattered. Right? We just needed to get through that assessment. That's what happens. Anyway, so here's an alternative to that, and see whether you like that. Anyone knows what this thing is on the left? Anyone recognizes this? Anyone here ever played Civilization? Oh, see, I like you. Again, I age myself. But it's a computer game that was running on a PC back in the day, before everyone was just daddling on the mobile. In this game, this thing was called a technology tree. And what it did is, you basically researched certain technologies in whatever sequence you liked, as long as you did it with all the dependencies. So it meant if you wanted to research a car, an automobile, you needed to have researched a combustion engine and tires and petroleum before that. Yeah, and in a very similar way, with one of my projects, we created on the right what is a continuous delivery technology tree. Right? So this bubble here on the very right is continuous delivery, and these are all the capabilities that are required to do continuous delivery. Anything from automated check-in to source code coding standard checks to automated unit testing to automated progression into the next environment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So now I'm not saying, do you do continuous delivery or do you do continuous integration, which is somewhere in here. It's like, which of these capabilities do you actually have, and what are you working on next? Yeah. And if any of you want a version of that, you can Twitter me, and I'll send you one, right? But to me, that is a much better thing, because the teams can use it themselves. They can just fill in blue or green or whatever the capabilities they have and what they're working on next. Yeah, and you can still guide them, which is the idea of a maturity model, without measuring them. So let's get into two technologies. Technologies is interesting, right? Because a lot of people choose technologies, I would say, arbitrarily. Right? Sometimes they're looking at the functionality of a specific technology and they just go for it. Sometimes it's because the vendor is playing golf with them. Sometimes they have good kickbacks. Who knows? Right? But I haven't seen conscious thought about this. And to me, it's like, of course, there's functionality, right? But then there's two other aspects that we need to think about. One is the architecture. So is this thing actually built in a way that scales well, that you can do easy monitoring for it, that you can easily change it? And then how easy is it to engineer around it? Like, can you actually get to the source code? Do you get to the APIs? Can I actually hook this in somewhere? Imagine you have a big package software where the only way to execute something is through clicking something in a UI. The levels of automation for that is pretty cruel, right? We talked about yesterday morning in the first talk about how CLI needs to be a first-order citizen, right? We need to have this as an impact when we think about technology choices. Yeah, and then, of course, you need to know what actual capabilities you have, right? If you're choosing a technology of a certain ilk and your skill set is completely different, then this is really, really painful. Now, I've been frustrated with businesses that they haven't done this, right? They create packaged software everywhere that they know they need to change, and they customize the bejesus out of it and wondering why it's expensive and why they can't maintain it, right? What a surprise. But We are the same in the DevOps world, right? Have you ever, so we talk about recreating environments from scratch, from code, right? Now, you don't have to raise your hand, but how many of you can recreate their whole DevOps tool chain from code? Until very recently, it would have been really tricky even to do with Jenkins, because all you get is an extracted XML file or whatever. It's not actually Jenkins as code. It's getting better now. But don't talk about other technologies that you might use, especially when you start using commercial products, right? They don't expose their configuration as code. There's a lot of test automation tools that can only work at the top of the pyramid, right? That means I can't trigger them. They're happy to trigger everything else for you, but you can't trigger their test automation tool through a command line or an API, right? So we have done exactly the same. Like, I'm frustrated with business. We in IT still have some work to do there as well. Right, so these are the kind of, this is the categories that I use when I assess DevOps tools. But to me, that's really important. I used to work with a lot of tools from a specific vendor that we had an enterprise license with. And it was impossible to get data out of it. Right? You could create reports within the tool, but if I wanted to correlate something from, let's say, from our deployment automation to our test automation, you couldn't do that because you could only look at the dashboards in each of these tools. But trying to extract relevant data out into a common dashboard was impossible, right? And those are the things that we need to get better at if you want to be successful. The complexity of what we are building now is increasing. That means we need to have much better tools and much more flexibility. Now, for that, we need to have these capabilities even in our own tools. So, if you are complaining that you're working with a technology where you can't spin up a new environment tomorrow morning, I dare you to stand up your DevOps tool chain tomorrow morning fresh. If you can't do that, you know you have also work to do, right? As they so often say, it's the cobbler's children who have the worst shoes, right? That's, I think, where we stand to some degree. So the next one is culture, and culture is something that I had to learn pretty harsh myself, right? So even when you give people all the things that they want, right? The methods, the tools, etc., right? And there's this great idea, which I think sounds really, really nice. It's like, we need to just get out of the way of our people, and they as teams will be successful. Yeah? And unfortunately, I see that failing again and again. I'm running a team that has a whole bunch of Agile coaches, and even with enough to just self-organize is hard, and it doesn't always work. And I was at a DevOps conference in Portugal. I was talking to someone, and he said, Mirco, I think I have the right analogy for this. And it's parenthood. So I have a 2.5-year-old that luckily is traveling with me at the moment, and I understand now what that means. Right? Because we wouldn't I want my son to be an independent adult that makes his own decisions. But I wouldn't right now, with 2.5 years, put him in the kitchen and say, go off, choose your food. Right? If I'm lucky, he will eat cookies all day. If I'm unlucky, he will find the drain cleaner or whatever, right? He doesn't have the capability to do that yet. And here's what happens when you have an existing old legacy organization. They have development teams. And an Agile coach comes in and says, okay, Mr. Organization, the problem that you have is you need to get out of the way of these people. Now, these people have been developing code for, let's say, 5 years. They never had to worry about security because there was a security person. They never had to worry about performance because there was a performance person. They never had to deploy into production because there was an operations person, et cetera, et cetera. So now we just say, you guys, you don't have to worry about these guys anymore. You're empowered to do it yourself. And then we are surprised when they don't exactly know what security constraints they have, what performance constraints they have, or how to deploy it into production. That's the same thing. We're taking it too quickly away from them. Right? And so there's this culture model by Lalou, which is really quite interesting. It talks about different levels, and look it up. It's really, really useful. It has different levels of organizational culture. At the bottom is kind of the power, fear, chaos, so the kind of mafia boss. Like, if you don't do the right thing, even though I haven't told you what the right thing is, I'm going to shoot you. Then we get to kind of command and control, which is very often associated with military. Then we get to orange, which is competition. So you don't have to follow all the rules as long as you're successful. Right? It's kind of capitalism at its best. Then we get to green. Green is kind of family-oriented. We care about our employees. We do the right decisions for our group. And then you get to teal, which brings all of these elements together in like a holistic sense. Yeah. Now, what happens in this kind of organizational example that I just gave is we go into an organization that has been command and control for a long time, and we just say, you should all just behave like a family. And they make a really good argument in this book and in the research behind this, that just doesn't happen that way. Right? You need to do some work along the lines. And here's what happened if you think about the old processes. Command and control said there's a very specific process that you need to follow to get anything done. Right? You need to fill in Excel sheets and all those kind of forms and whatever to get something done. Right? Competition is then when you have an automated process where you still are very much constrained by the process, but you can break it if you have a better way of doing it. Yeah? And then you can get into everyone chooses their own. Yeah? But to me, that is, we've done a disservice to organizations when we just going to just get out of the way of people. And I have at least a dozen examples where organizations went in, kind of said, you guys do what you want now, and then a year later or 18 months later, they have to pull it back. I'll give you an example of one of my clients. They said, okay, we're going to do Agile, and in Agile, the team should decide what they're doing. Now, not surprisingly, they had many different tools, many different methods in the organization. And so if any executive sponsor wanted to look at what's going on, they had to open Jira and Rally and IBM and TFS, and then all of these were different. Now, they hadn't agreed on a common terminology, so sometimes a feature was higher than a story, sometimes an epic was higher than a feature, sometimes features were higher than the epic. It created utter chaos. One thing we all talk about is system thinking. Right? We shouldn't optimize the individual bits over the overall system. And that's what happens in those cases when you jump straight here. The individual units will start optimizing to the detriment of the system. Yeah? And that's a very, very, sometimes dangerous, sometimes just inefficient thing. Yeah? And then, of course, this is just the dip. And then we have this thing, and I'm as much as fault as anyone else with that, around management, right? The guys up there just don't understand it. Yeah? And that's actually surprising research. Right? So this is from 1991 from a book called Quality Software Management and Systems. And they did something what I find quite fascinating. Right? So they went into an organization for which there are 100 best practices. I said, how many are you using here? So they went to the vice president, 67 or so said, of those practices we use here. Then go to the director, I said, 55. All the way down to the engineer, I said, 12. Right? So the people on the front line had a very different view of where they are as an organization to the executives. And that shouldn't be surprising that then decisions are being made that are not necessarily helpful, right? Because decisions are being made up here based on the belief that they have. Now, that was 1991. Clearly, we've got better. This is from the Puppet State of DevOps report, where they look at 15 criteria of DevOps. The C-suite thinks 58% of them are being implemented, the engineers 37%. Still a bit abstract, perhaps not as bad, but it still shows you there's a difference. Now, the last example I find even more shocking. This is from the Accelerate State of DevOps report. So the people who report to a State of DevOps report tend to have some grasp of DevOps. Yeah? My mom, my dad, they don't respond to State of DevOps report. People who respond to that have heard about DevOps. So that means these are people who are a bit closer to our kind of thinking. When they were asked, who here is using the cloud? 67% of them said they're using the cloud. When subsequent questions ask them about the 5 characteristics defined by the National Institute of Standards in the US for cloud, that drops down to 22%. Yeah? So that means most of the people in the DevOps community that believe they're using cloud are not even using it according to the bare minimum standards defined. That's how difficult this place is. So we shouldn't be surprised that we have to re-explain it to our executives again and again and again and again. And that we have to work really closely with everyone to make the right decisions. Yeah, this is not because people are dumb, it's because it's complex. And I know everyone is wondering, what is this difference? Here's the 2 things that you need to think about if you're using the cloud. Can you self-service? Can you create something without having to send an email, an Excel sheet or anything like that, just to an API call. That's where a lot of this dropped. And the second one, are you actually only paying for what you're using? Yeah, so if you're using the cloud but your instance is running 24/7, then obviously you're not actually using the cloud correctly. Right? But this is a challenge that we have in our culture, that we believe everyone has the same knowledge. And we need to be quite honest that we even ourselves might not have the right knowledge. Right? On many of the projects that I work with, I don't always know what's exactly happening. And we need to have the humility to go back and ask, and maybe make decisions to validate that, rather than just continue with our assumptions. There's another thing around tools, right? So there's quite a cultural aspect around that as well, in my view, because there are these organizations or people who believe it's the one tool to bind them all, right? Everything here needs to be with Docker or with Jenkins or whatever. And then there's everyone does their own thing and everyone brings their own tools, right? And to be honest, both of them don't really work terribly well. Right? This is too restrictive. This is too much chaos and too much maintenance effort. So what you really need to do is you need to figure out what you allow, what means you allow. Like if there's a new tool coming up, someone wants to play with something new, let them. But then after a certain period of time, they need to either justify why they continue using it and you approving it as a corporate tool, or you say, no, it's not significantly better than anything else, you're going to go back to our standards. Yeah, so allow this kind of, you let it breathe and then you bring it back in, but in a very conscious way rather than this kind of wild west that we often see. All right, so let's go to the last one, which is over-optimism that I mentioned. And that I am as guilty of as everyone else, right? If I get a return code 0, everything is fine. That is kind of the shortest description of this that I can give you. But I was working with an organization where they had a very complex deployment process, right? And I kept asking, what's going on here? Why is this not reliable? And I was like, oh, Mirco, look, once we have automated it all, it will be fine. For now, we just have to live with what it is. I'm like, okay, I understand that. So what are you doing in the meantime until you've automated it all? Like, how do you manage the process? The non-automated bits. And you say, oh, no, we don't do that because, it will be automated. And every answer there was like that, right? We believe the technology at some stage will solve the problem, so we don't have to worry about it right now. And that ended up being a huge mess. They had lots of automation where literally, like when the return code 0 came back, they assumed it was done. There was no validation done. So if for whatever reason the database wasn't created successful, but it came back with a return code 0 and you had basically empty tables, that was fine. Right? No one would notice that until someone would actually run a test in the test environment or worst case in production. So that's been very, very painful. So for these guys, we ended up going through the process, and we wanted to make this data-driven. So we asked them, what do you have data for? And then we realized that most of the data was just in Jenkins. And that was all they had, this little bit here. And the rest of the process was unmanaged. So we had to actually write this whole process down, figure out how we can get measurement points, and then we said, okay, here are steps that are not existing at all, here are steps that are manual, and that way we can drive this forward. So this tech optimism has some other problems as well, right? Documentation is another one of those, right? Documentation is just in the code, right? Documentation as code is fine. It is fine, but that means only people who know your technology can read it. Anyone else who wants to understand what's going on is excluded. That is technist. I don't know, it's not racist and sexist, but it's technist. That means no one else, no business person, no manager can actually review what you're doing. You can't do that. We just use a wiki. All the documentation is in wiki. And then wiki is a wild, wild west of 10 different versions of the same document. No one knows which is its current. No one manages that. That's another typical... The wiki itself doesn't solve your problem. You still need to manage it. And that's unfortunately on you. All right? And then we're automating horrendous shit. Right? If you can't document something, you can't automate it. Because you're just automating what someone has been saying or what you've been doing on your machine. But if you can't agree on a visualization of the process, then whatever you automate is just what is in someone's head. And someone else said that yesterday. So I really like this. And then this here is awesome, right? To err is human, but if you want to create a catastrophe, you need automation, right? It's really hard when you manually do something in production, it's really hard to destroy all servers. When you have automation, it goes really quick. Yeah, and there's plenty of examples where people have destroyed whole companies by running a wrong delete command on Amazon or something like that. Yeah, so be really careful with that. All right, so I'm going to skip over that. So what can we do? The first thing is we need to do really continuous improvement in the right way. So this kind of PDCA or whatever you want to use. But the key to that is when you're doing an improvement, figure out how you can measure what you're going to do and then go back to it. Don't just do stuff. Figure out how would we know that this is successful. More continuous integration, more test automation does not necessarily solve a problem. Then you need to visualize stuff, and this is a value stream map, which I always use. There's lots of, everyone in the DevOps community talks about value stream maps. It's the best tool to use for that. And then last but not least, report reality. So what I said before, get all the data out of your tools. Look at that. Don't look at PowerPoints, Excel sheets. Don't get caught in just one tool. Aggregate it out and look at reality. And with those three things, I think you can be really, really successful. Thank you. My time is up. If you want to get the slides, you can get them automatically. It's DevOps, so just send them to there and you get the slides. And thank you for spending the 45 minutes with me.
Thank you. Thank you. Mirco, we have a couple of questions from the audience we would like you to answer. So let's go with the most viral one. Scrum or Kanban for DevOps team? Check out the mark. Yeah.
So I think if you take a DevOps team, and the definition of that is they do development work on new projects as well as operational tasks and application maintenance, then I would actually say both. Right? So you might well have certain capacity that operates with Scrum to have that kind of planability, etc., and you have a certain capacity that runs as Kanban for the ad hoc stuff and the high priority stuff. And I see that as what we use the most. So a bit of both.
Okay, thank you. There's another one that has 8 likes. Which DevOps Agile Lean training resources could you recommend? Are certifications any good? So 2 questions.
I will ask the second part first. Are certifications any good? Look, if you apply for a job in my group and you have a certification, I don't give a rat's ass about it. Certification for yourself can be good because they give you a certain standard to achieve to. So it gives you something to strive for. For yourself, I think they're useful. For anyone outside of yourself, they're not useful. Some people differ, but that would be my recommendation. In regards to what training resources to, obviously there's a bunch of really good books, including mine, but no, there are other really good books. But what I do is I go to conferences like this and talk to people because that's where I learn the most. If you want to go really deep, I will go to things like a Coursera course or something like that. Like I did, for example, a Coursera course on blockchain because I wanted to go pretty deep into it. And then vendor training can be pretty good if that's a tool that you want to work with or that you know that you're going to work with that tool in the future. But you just need to understand that they teach you their way. And we're going back to that dogma, right? Are you now in the Judean People's Front or in the People's Front of Judea when you go to those trainings? I don't think industry-wide there is a lot of great overall DevOps trainings because it's so specific, right? So we talk about security, performance, observability. I think the vendor trainings are probably at this stage still better than any kind of really super generic stuff. The DevOps Institute has some core trainings that I like, but they're more for you to understand the overall curriculum, like the common book of knowledge that we have. Yesterday, Roman talked about quite a few of the books that people reference, and those trainings have that material. So that can be useful if you're beginning the journey.
Thank you. Okay, then there's another one, but I think it might be related to that. Nope, not that one.
That one we had.
Yep. Yes, that one. What's your experience with Agile projects with fixed budget? Have you learned, or what have you learned, and or any advice?
So I'm working for a service provider, right? So I can tell you that in my experience, 70% of the work we're getting is fixed budget. But it's not fixed scope, right? And that, I think, is the difference. So if you want to do Agile with fixed scope, I think you're going to be screwed. Right? I don't see that ever working. But if you have fixed budget, that means we are saying we have X amount of money to spend to solve a problem. And now the team together needs to solve, with that budget, how can we best solve the problem? And I think that's helpful, because if you don't have a constraint, you're not going to be terribly creative. If I tell you, solve this problem, money is not a problem, you're going to build Rube Goldberg solutions that are super, super fancy, but not necessarily solve the problem. Right? So I think fixed budget is okay. Fixed scope is where the real challenge is.